Pick them up! Travis Beaumont threw his gloves onto the grass and pointed at the quiet man holding a paper plate. Right now, in front of everybody. The block party went silent. A rich kid, 21 years old, 3 black belts, his father, watching from the deck. Phones came up all around the yard. Malcolm Brooks did not pick up the gloves. He set the plate down and counted the cameras one by one, taking his time. Then he looked back at the kid, calm like a man who had run this exact scene before and already knew how it ended. Malcolm Brooks ran the same loop every morning out past the mailboxes and down to the end of Halden Court, where the street gave up and turned into a wall of pine trees. He had been running it for 3 years since the month his wife died, because the alternative was sitting in a house built for 2 people that now held 1. His son was finishing a degree 4 states away and called on Sundays. The rest of the week belonged to the road, the trees, and the sound of his own breathing. At the last house before the turnaround, an old man sat on his porch with a cup of coffee in both hands. Graham Whitaker had lived there longer than anyone else on the street, and he did not wave at people. He nodded once, and Malcolm nodded back, and neither of them ever slowed down for it. Some mornings that nod was the only exchange Malcolm had with another human being before noon. The neighbors on Halden Court liked Malcolm the way people like a well-behaved dog. He carried groceries up Nora Fielding's driveway when her arms were full. He returned trash cans that had blown into the wrong yard. He said good morning, and he meant it, and then he went back inside and closed the door. In 4 years, nobody had heard him raise his voice, and that fact had quietly become part of his description the way his height was. Across from him, Ray Doyle had installed a doorbell camera the previous spring after a package went missing and had aimed it wrong. Instead of covering his own porch, it stared out across the street and took in the whole shared green at the center of the court, the picnic tables, the grass, the section where the block party tents went up every summer. Ray complained about it at least twice a year and never fixed it. Malcolm worked from a room at the back of the house with 2 monitors and a filing cabinet that locked. He did security consulting for federal contracts, a sentence that ended conversations, and he had learned to let it. When people pressed, he said he read paperwork for a living. That was close enough to true. The paperwork was the part that mattered. There had been a different version of him once. He did not talk about it, and there was one specific reason, and the reason had a date attached to it. It happened outside a bar in Norfolk a long time ago when a man he had never met put a hand on him and then put a second hand on him. Malcolm ended it in under 4 seconds, which at the time he considered a mercy. Every report written afterward described the same thing in the same order. A black man 6'2", 210 pounds had struck a civilian. The other man's size was not recorded. Neither was the fact that he had swung first. It took Malcolm 6 months and 2 lawyers to get the file closed. Nothing about him changed in those 6 months, except one understanding which settled into him and never left. For a man built like him with a face like his, winning a fight was the same as losing everything that came after it. He was not afraid of anyone on that street. He was afraid of the 20 seconds of video that would exist afterward and of who would be standing in the frame when it started. So he ran his loop and he nodded at Graham Whitaker, and he did not pick fights, and the neighborhood decided he was a gentleman. He let them decide it. It was cheaper than the truth. The Beaumonts moved into the corner lot at the end of May, and they arrived the way money arrives, with a landscaping crew before the furniture. Douglas Beaumont ran a freight company. His father had started 300 trucks and a name painted on every door of every one of them. He shook hands with the whole street in a single afternoon and remembered everybody's name on the second pass, a skill he had clearly practiced. His son came with him. Travis Beaumont was 21, built through the shoulders, and moved like someone who had been told his whole life that he moved well. 3 black belts and 3 disciplines earned at 3 different schools. He mentioned them the way other people mention the weather, and within 2 weeks, everyone on Halden Court knew about all 3. He also had a way of looking at people that sorted them immediately. Nora Fielding, who ran the block party every year, got a polite smile. Ray Doyle got a nod. When Travis first saw Malcolm walking back from the mailbox in a gray t-shirt and work boots, he looked at him for a full second longer than was comfortable, and something in him decided what Malcolm was. The first thing was the truck. Malcolm drove a 15-year-old pickup with a dent in the rear panel he had never bothered to fix, and Travis started parking his own car at the mouth of Malcolm's driveway, not blocking it exactly, but close enough that backing out took 3 turns instead of 1. Malcolm made the 3 turns. He never mentioned it. Then it was the name. Travis started calling him the security guard, first to his friends, then loud enough for Malcolm to hear across the grass. He said it with a grin like it was affectionate, and the friends laughed because that was what the grin asked them to do. Malcolm would lift a hand and keep walking, and Travis would watch him go with the particular satisfaction of a man confirming something. Douglas saw all of it from his deck and said nothing, and the saying nothing was its own kind of instruction. On a Thursday morning in early June, Travis was out in the driveway at 6:30 with a jump rope, and he stopped when Malcolm came down the sidewalk on the back half of his loop. He watched him the whole way past, waiting to be acknowledged, and got nothing and shouted something about how a man that size ought to try lifting something heavier than his own feet. Malcolm kept his pace and did not turn his head. 40 seconds later, he reached the end of the court where Graham Whitaker was sitting with the same cup he always had. The old man had heard it. He looked at Malcolm, and Malcolm looked at him, and Whitaker nodded once slower than usual, and Malcolm nodded back and made the turn for home. Nothing was said. Nora Fielding sent out the block party notice the second week of June, the same one she sent every year. Tents on the green last Saturday of July, bring a dish. Ray Doyle wrote back to the whole thread, complaining that his doorbell kept recording every car that came down Halden Court because the angle was wrong and that he was going to get around to fixing it one of these days. Nobody replied. He did not fix it. The file landed on a Tuesday. Malcolm opened the assignment package in his back room the way he had opened 400 others, expecting 8 weeks of maintenance records and driver logs. The cover sheet said Beaumont Freight Systems, and under it a federal logistics contract worth more than anything he had reviewed in 2 years. He read the name 3 times. Then he looked out the window at the corner lot where a landscaping crew was still fixing the hedges. He wrote the conflict of interest disclosure that same afternoon and sent it before dinner, thorough about it, because being thorough was the only protection he had ever found. The subject of his active review lived 140 yards from his front door. Their son had spoken to him directly on at least 4 occasions. He requested immediate reassignment. Ellen Hartley called him back the next morning. She had run his division for 9 years, and she did not soften things, which was why he had lasted under her. "You're not getting reassigned," she said. "The file's at final stage. Handing it off now puts the whole contract back 6 months, and the department has people watching that timeline who are not friendly." Malcolm stood at the window while she talked and watched Travis pull into the mouth of his driveway again. "That's a schedule problem," he said, "not an ethics answer. Here's the ethics answer." Ellen's voice went flat in the way it did when she was building a wall. "If proximity disqualifies a reviewer, then any company that wants a friendlier one just has to buy the house next door. I'm not opening that door. You stay on it." He asked what the condition was, because there was always a condition, and she gave it to him without hesitating. Every contact with any member of the Beaumont family logged. Time, location, witnesses, content. Nothing informal, nothing off the record, nothing handled between neighbors. If a Beaumont said good morning to him at the mailbox, it went in the log by that evening. "And Malcolm." Ellen let the line sit before she finished. "You understand what that means about your temper?" "I understood it before you called," he said. He hung up and sat down at the desk and did not move for a while. Something had changed in the shape of the street outside his window, and it was not the street. Every stupid thing Travis Beaumont did from that moment forward was no longer a stupid thing. It was evidence, and it was evidence that could only ever be used against one of the two of them. If Malcolm reacted once in any way that could be filmed, the review he was writing would be worthless. Not wrong. Worthless. A biased document produced by a compromised reviewer thrown out on procedure with everything inside it thrown out too. He opened the log and made the first entry. Subject's son parked across the mouth of the driveway at 8:40 in the morning. Vehicle remained approximately 20 minutes. No verbal exchange, no witnesses recorded. Reading it back, he understood exactly how it would look to anyone who ever opened that file. A federal reviewer writing down the parking habits of the man he was investigating. It looked like a grudge being built in advance. There was no version of the next 8 weeks in which he came out clean, and the only thing he could control was whether the report itself was true. Then he opened the maintenance records. It took him 11 days to find it. Beaumont Freight ran a clean-looking system, and that was the first thing that bothered him. The inspection intervals were too even. Real fleets had gaps, missed weeks a mechanic out with the flu in February. This one had none across 4 terminals for 2 straight years. He pulled the metadata on the digital logs, and the file structure told him what the numbers would not. 61 entries across a 14-month window had been created after the dates they recorded, some by weeks, one by 9 months. The 9-month gap sat around a single tanker unit, and when he traced the vehicle identification number back through the state incident database, he found the rollover. Interstate ramp wet grade 22 months ago. The tanker had gone over and the driver had not gotten out of it. The name in the report was Carl Rennick, 44 years old, 11 years with the company. The internal finding blamed speed. The brake service record attached to the file had been created 3 weeks after Rennick was buried. Malcolm read the whole thing twice and then sat back in a quiet house with the window open, listening to a car door slam at the corner lot. It was no longer a paperwork problem. Somewhere in that company there was an original maintenance record that had never been altered, and the difference between it and the one on his screen was a dead man. He filed a formal request for the unaltered originals from all 4 terminals on a Friday morning. Douglas Beaumont got the notice by Friday afternoon, and he did the arithmetic in about 90 seconds. He had known for 2 weeks who his neighbor worked for. The disclosure had come back through his own legal counsel's standard procedure, and he had read it with something close to amusement. Now the amusement was gone. The problem was not that Malcolm Brooks was strict. A strict reviewer could be answered. The problem was that a request for originals meant the man already knew the copies were false, and once that was written into a final report with a signature on it, no amount of lawyering would unwrite it. Douglas did not need a friendlier reviewer. He needed the file to stop existing. He understood the mechanism perfectly because it was the same one he used to move drivers off routes. A reviewer removed for a scheduling conflict was replaced quietly, and the work continued. A reviewer removed for misconduct was different. Misconduct voided the product. Every finding, every page, every request for originals, all of it tainted, all of it pulled the whole process restarted from a clean intake with a new name at the top and no memory of what the last man had gone looking for. 6 months, maybe 8, long enough to reconcile 4 terminals worth of paper into something that matched, and there was exactly one kind of misconduct that a man like Malcolm Brooks could be made to commit in front of witnesses. Douglas never told his son to do anything. He was careful about that in the way careful men are, and he would have said if asked that he had never asked for a thing in his life. He came out onto the deck that evening while Travis was working. The heavy bag hung from the pergola beam, and he watched for a while with a drink in his hand. Down the street, Malcolm's truck rolled past with its dented panel, slow the way he always drove it. "He doesn't even look at you," Douglas said. "You notice that man looks right through you like you're not even standing there." He took a sip and turned back toward the door. "And you just take it." Travis hit the bag once more hard, and it swung wide on the chain. His father went inside without saying anything else, which was the entire point. By the next morning, Travis had convinced himself the whole thing was his own idea, and he went looking for the quiet man at the end of the street. He started with the truck. Malcolm came out on a Sunday morning in early July and found a white streak of spray paint running the length of the driver's side over the dent, ending in a shape that was not quite a word. He stood in his driveway and looked at it for a while. Then he went back inside, got his phone, and photographed it from 4 angles with the timestamp on. He logged it at 8:52. He did not knock on any doors. The neighbors noticed. Nora Fielding came across the grass with her hands in her pockets and told him he ought to call somebody about that, and Malcolm said he had a record of it, which was true and was not an answer. She waited to see if he would say more. He thanked her for checking and went to get a bucket. After that, it became a routine, and the routine had an audience. Travis took to working out on his own front lawn in the evenings, facing down the street, throwing combinations at nothing. When Malcolm's truck came past, he would stop mid-round and stare, and if his friends were over, one of them would laugh. Twice he crossed the street to shadow box on the sidewalk directly in front of Malcolm's house, close enough that the sound of his breathing carried through the open window of the back room where Malcolm was reading brake service records. Malcolm logged it. Time duration witnesses. He kept the window open because closing it would have been a reaction. The clips started around the middle of the month. Travis posted them himself, 10 and 15 seconds each, always the same frame, a big man in a gray t-shirt walking away with groceries or a hose or a bag of mulch captioned with something about how some people talk tough until somebody actually shows up. None of them showed Malcolm's face clearly. All of them showed the house. By the third one, Travis had stopped bothering with captions and started asking directly. He said it across the driveway one evening while Malcolm was carrying a bag of soil around to the side yard, 1 round. Gloves, no gloves, whatever the man wanted. Just once so everybody on the street could stop pretending. Malcolm set the bag down and looked at him for a moment. "No," he said, and picked the bag back up. That was the whole exchange. It went into the log that night with the time and the note that there had been no witnesses, and it was the third time that month Travis had asked. Ellen Hartley read all of it and wrote back one line telling him to keep filing and to stay out of the man's line of sight where he could advice from someone who did not live on Halden Court. Wesley Tate lived 4 houses down and filmed everything. He was in his 30s, worked nights, and had a phone in his hand from the moment he came out his door, streaming the street to a few dozen people who watched it for reasons nobody else understood. He filmed the mail truck. He filmed a raccoon in Ray Doyle's gutter for 11 minutes. Ray had told him twice to point that thing somewhere else, and Nora had told him once more politely. And Wesley had laughed and kept walking and kept filming. Around the middle of July, the street stopped being amused and started feeling sorry for Malcolm, and that was worse. People began doing small kindnesses at him. Frank Alvarado, who lived beside the green and had never talked to Malcolm about anything but lawn equipment, started saying good morning twice. Nora offered him a chair at the party planning table he had not asked for. The pity was gentle and it was constant, and every bit of it confirmed the same thing to Travis Beaumont, which was that the man at the end of the street would not do anything ever, no matter what was done to him. He was not entirely wrong about that. He was wrong about why. What nobody on Halden Court knew was what those 3 black belts actually were. They hung in a frame on the wall of Douglas Beaumont's office, not in his son's room, mounted with the tournament photographs and arranged by date. Travis had earned all 3 and had chosen none of them. The first school was picked because a client of his father's had a son there. He liked it for about a year somewhere in the stretch when nobody was watching, and then it became a thing that got measured. He was 19 when he tried to stop. He said it at dinner, and he said it badly, and what he actually meant was that he wanted one afternoon that did not get discussed afterward. Douglas set down his fork, looked at him with an expression that was not anger, and gave him the same line he had been giving him for as long as Travis could remember. "Don't embarrass me in front of people." Travis went back the next week and tested for the 3rd belt 4 months later. He never told anyone about that dinner. There were nights in July standing on the lawn throwing punches at nothing while a man carried mulch around a house when something in him went quiet and asked what exactly he was doing out there. He had no answer for it, so he hit the bag harder, and in the morning it was gone. The block party fell on the last Saturday in July. Nora had the tents up by 10 and by 4 in the afternoon. The green at the center of Halden Court was full folding tables, end to end, a cooler line along the curb, Frank Alvarado working the grill and complaining about the grill. Ray Doyle brought a speaker and set it on the tailgate of his truck. Wesley Tate brought his phone and started his stream from the sidewalk, panning across the tables, narrating the food. Malcolm came because not coming would have been a statement. He stood near the edge with a paper plate, talking to nobody for very long, and had already decided he would leave by 6. Douglas Beaumont set up on his own deck at the corner lot with a drink above the green and off to the side where he could see everything and be part of nothing. Travis came across the grass at 5:20 with a pair of bag gloves in his hand. He threw them down in front of Malcolm and pointed at him and said it loud enough to reach the far tables. "Pick them up, right now, in front of everybody!" The music ran a few seconds longer before Ray got to the tailgate and killed it, and then he came back down into the crowd and stopped about 6 feet from where the 2 men were standing. Phones came up around the yard. Somebody laughed badly and stopped. Malcolm set his plate on the table beside him. He looked around the green, unhurried, counting what he was looking at, and then he looked back at the young man in front of him. "I'm not fighting you," he said. "Not today, not any day. I'm asking you to walk back to your house." He said it clearly, and he said it toward the middle of the crowd rather than at Travis, and afterward more than 20 people would remember hearing every word. Travis grinned. He had rehearsed for a lot of things, but not for that, so he did what he knew, which was to keep talking. He asked whether that was how it worked, whether the man just said no and everybody clapped. He said something about the security guard, he said something about the truck and about mulch, and he was losing the room and could feel it, and the more he felt it, the further out he went. Then he found the thing that was left. He said he had heard about the wife. He said she must have gotten out at the right time because nobody should have to spend a life next to a man who would not even stand up straight in his own yard. Nora Fielding said his name once sharply. Nobody else made a sound. Malcolm did not move. His hands stayed at his sides and his weight stayed exactly where it had been, and his face changed so little that Frank Alvarado, standing 8 feet away, would later say the man had looked like he was listening to a weather report. That was what did it. Travis had spent 2 months hunting for a reaction, had just used the last thing he had, and had gotten nothing in front of the whole street with his father watching from the deck. He stepped in and threw a right hand at Malcolm's head. Nora saw it. Ray Doyle saw it from 6 feet away. Frank Alvarado saw it over the top of the grill and started moving before it landed. It did not land. Malcolm shifted his lead foot a few inches and turned his shoulder, and the punch went through the space where his jaw had been and kept going, and Travis had to catch himself on his own momentum. It was so small a movement that half the yard did not register it as a movement at all. Travis came back with a kick high and clean, the kind that scores. Malcolm slid a half step off the line, and it passed his ribs. Then Travis went for the clinch, got a grip on his shoulder, and drove for the takedown, and Malcolm broke the hold with one short rotation of his arm and put a palm flat on the young man's chest and pushed him off. Not down, off. Travis stumbled backward 4 steps and stayed on his feet, and the humiliation of being set aside like a gate was worse than being hit. He came in the 3rd time with everything he had, no technique left in it, arms wide. Malcolm caught him, turned his hips, and took him to the grass. It happened in under 2 seconds and made almost no noise. Then he was on top of him with one forearm across the shoulder and one knee placed where a knee needs to be, and Travis could not move any part of himself that mattered. There was no punch. There had been no punch in the entire sequence. Malcolm brought his head down close and spoke so that only Travis could hear it. "Breathe. It's over." He held him 4 seconds until the fight went out of the body underneath him, then let go and stood and stepped back with his hands open at his sides. Travis stayed where he was on the grass. Graham Whitaker came out of the crowd then. Nobody had noticed the old man arrive, but he had a folding chair under one arm and had clearly been there a while. He walked to where Travis was pushing himself up onto an elbow, stopped in front of him, and spoke without any particular volume, which was why everyone heard it. "Son, you were just given your life back and you don't even know it happened." He looked down at the young man on the grass. 20 years ago, I signed the orders that sent men like him off the back of a ship. He was the one I worried about every single time, not because he came back short-handed. The old man's mouth moved slightly. Because he came back and I never once had to write a report explaining what he did while he was gone. Nobody spoke. Ray Doyle looked at Malcolm, then looked at the ground. Malcolm did not confirm any of it and did not deny it. He picked his plate off the table, dropped it in the trash barrel by the curb, said goodnight to Nora because she was standing closest, and walked back down Halden Court to his own house while the entire street watched him go. On the deck, Douglas Beaumont finished his drink and went inside to make a phone call. The clip went up that night. It ran 22 seconds. It opened on Malcolm's hand, pushing Travis backward across the grass, and ended with the takedown and the forearm across the shoulder, cut clean without a frame of what came before. There were no gloves in it. There was no refusal in it. There was nothing about a wife. What it showed was a large black man in his 40s putting a 21-year-old on the ground at a neighborhood party while people stood around and did nothing. By midnight, it had 400,000 views. By the following evening, it had 9 million, and the comments were exactly the comments Malcolm had known they would be since the year he stood outside a bar in Norfolk and learned how a report gets written. He watched it once in the dark at the desk in the back room. Everything he had refused to do for 2 months, every 3-point turn out of his own driveway, every logged entry, every time he set a bag down and said no, and picked the bag back up. All of it gone in 22 seconds because he had finally been given no way to stand still. He had known this would happen. He had arranged his entire life around making sure it could not. It happened anyway. Douglas Beaumont's formal complaint reached the department on Monday morning, filed through counsel with the clip attached, and a written statement from his son. It did not accuse Malcolm of a crime. It was smarter than that. It alleged that the assigned reviewer held a personal hostility toward the subject family documented on video and that his continued involvement compromised the integrity of the entire evaluation. It requested his immediate removal and the withdrawal of all findings produced under his signature. Ellen Hartley called at 8:40 and told him the department had opened a conduct inquiry, that his file authority was intact until it wasn't, and that he had a very small window. That was the part Malcolm sat with for the rest of the day. He still held the signature. He could close the evaluation that afternoon. He had the metadata, the 61 backdated entries, the 9-month gap the brake service record created 3 weeks after Carl Rennick was in the ground. One signature, and Beaumont Freight lost the contract before the conduct inquiry ever finished. And every page of it would be read backward through those 22 seconds. A compromised reviewer with a documented grudge had disqualified the company whose son he had put on the ground. That was the story. It would be the story in the appeal in the press in whatever hearing came after, and it would work because it was clean and easy and required no one to look at a maintenance log. The findings would be pulled with him. The dead driver would go back to being a man who drove too fast on a wet ramp. Malcolm sat in the back room with the cursor in the signature field and understood the shape of it completely. He had the power to win, and using it was the only guaranteed way to lose. He closed the file without signing it. Then he opened a new document and wrote his own withdrawal, and it took him until 2 in the morning, not because it was long, but because every sentence had to be something a hostile lawyer could read out loud without finding a place to stand. He requested removal from the Beaumont freight evaluation effective immediately on the grounds that a physical altercation with a member of the subject family had occurred and that no finding of his could now be considered clean, regardless of the underlying facts. He attached everything, the 61 backdated entries and the metadata that proved them, the 9-month gap, the brake service record created 3 weeks after Carl Rennick's funeral, his formal request for the unaltered originals from all 4 terminals still unanswered. The complete contact log, 74 entries starting with a car parked across the mouth of his driveway at 8:40 in the morning. He also attached Douglas Beaumont's complaint in full, including the 22-second clip, with no commentary and nothing removed. Then he routed the entire package to an independent review board rather than back through his own division. From that moment forward, he had no control over any part of it. He could not withdraw it, amend it, or ask anyone what was being done with it. Whatever the board concluded, they would conclude it about a file he had built and could no longer touch. He sat with the send confirmation on the screen for a long time. Every instinct he had spent 25 years developing said the same thing, which was that you do not hand a weapon to someone else in the middle of a fight. He sent it anyway. The weapon had stopped being a weapon the second that clip went up, and the only value left in it was the part that was true. Ellen Hartley called him at 7 the next morning, and she was not calm. "You had the authority to close it," she said. "You could have finished this yesterday." Malcolm stood at the window with coffee he had not touched. "And it gets thrown out on appeal in 6 weeks, and everything in it goes out with me. This way the file survives whether I do or not." She was quiet long enough that he could hear her chair move. Then she told him she thought he had just ended his own career, and he said he knew, and she said she would forward it herself, so the timestamp would be hers as well as his. The other half of it happened on Halden Court, and Malcolm had nothing to do with that. Graham Whitaker walked 4 houses down on Sunday afternoon and knocked on Wesley Tate's door. He did not explain much. He asked whether the stream from Saturday had been saved, and Wesley said everything was saved. Everything he had ever filmed was saved the first time in 11 years. Anyone had treated that as useful instead of annoying. The stream ran 4 hours. The segment that mattered ran 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and Wesley found it in under a minute. It started before Travis crossed the grass and ended after Whitaker finished speaking. It had the gloves landing on the ground. It had Malcolm setting his plate down. It had the refusal in full spoken clearly toward the middle of the crowd. It had the thing that was said about a dead woman, and it had the right hand that came afterward, from an angle where nobody could argue about who moved first. The old man watched the last 2 minutes of it standing in the doorway, then asked for 3 copies. Ray Doyle's doorbell gave them the second angle. It had been pointed at the green for over a year because he had never gotten around to fixing it, and it had recorded the block party the way it recorded everything, catching the sequence from the opposite side of the yard. Nora Fielding wrote her statement that evening. Frank Alvarado wrote his the next day and included the detail about Malcolm's face and the weather report. Ray wrote his last and shortest, and the only line in it that mattered was that he had been standing 6 feet away and that the young man had thrown the first punch and it had not been close. Whitaker collected all 3, drove them to a copy shop, and sent them to the independent board himself because he did not trust email and because he wanted his own name on the envelope. The board convened 3 weeks later in a hearing room with beige walls and a table that seated 9, chaired by a woman named Marjorie Vance, who had spent 22 years doing exactly this and had the specific patience of someone who could not be hurried by money. Douglas Beaumont came with 2 attorneys and a prepared statement about a federal reviewer with a documented pattern of hostility. Travis came because he had been told to come and sat at the end of the row in a jacket that did not fit the way his father's did looking at the table. Malcolm came alone. He was not there as the reviewer anymore. He was there as the subject of a conduct inquiry, and he sat where they told him to sit and answered what he was asked. The lead attorney played the 22-second clip first on the screen at the end of the room and asked the board to consider whether any person could produce an impartial evaluation of a family whose son he had physically restrained in front of 40 witnesses. It was a good presentation. It ran 11 minutes, and it was almost entirely correct. Marjorie Vance thanked him. Then she said the board had received a second recording from a resident of the same street and asked the clerk to play it in full. 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The room watched the gloves hit the grass. They watched Malcolm set down the plate and count the phones. They heard him say he was not fighting, not today and not any day, and heard him ask the young man to go back to his house. They heard the line about the wife and a woman's voice saying a name sharply, and then they watched the right hand come and watched a man move 4 inches and not throw anything back. They watched the last 2 seconds where a knee comes off a shoulder and a hand opens and a man steps away without ever having closed his fist. Nobody on the board said a word while it played. One of the attorneys stopped writing about 90 seconds in. Travis watched from the end of the row and did not look away, and it took more out of him than the fight had. He had lived inside his own version of that afternoon for 3 weeks, and his version had been shorter and had started later. On the screen, it started with him walking across the grass with gloves in his hand while a man he had never once spoken to properly stood there holding a paper plate. He heard his own voice say the thing about the wife at full volume. In a beige room in front of 9 strangers and his father, and understood for the first time that everyone on Halden Court had heard it exactly like that. When the recording ended, Marjorie Vance asked one question, and she asked it of Malcolm. "Mr. Brooks, you held signature authority on this evaluation until the morning you withdrew. You could have closed it. Why didn't you?" Malcolm answered without any preamble. "Because if I close it, the file becomes about me. Everything in it gets read as something a man did after a fight in his front yard, and it gets pulled and it gets restarted, and by the time somebody looks at those 4 terminals again, the paper will match." He kept his hands flat on the table in front of him. "The findings are either true without my signature or they were never worth anything. That's why they're in front of you and not in front of me." Vance made a note and did not respond to it. The lead attorney asked for a recess. After the recess, the board moved to the second item on the agenda, which was the maintenance documentation, and that took the rest of the afternoon and most of the following day. The finding when it came was narrow and it was final. Beaumont Freight Systems was disqualified from the federal logistics contract for falsification of safety maintenance records across 4 terminals, including the concealment of a brake service failure connected to a fatal rollover 2 years earlier. The finding named Carl Rennick. It ran to 90 pages, and the block party was not mentioned in any of them. Douglas Beaumont's conduct was referred out for separate investigation, covering the obstruction of a federal evaluation and the concealment of a fatality. His attorney stopped answering his calls at the usual speed. The athletic federation that had certified Travis reviewed the full recording, suspended his competitive standing, and required completion of a behavioral program before any reinstatement would be considered. He did not appeal it. The conduct inquiry against Malcolm was closed with no finding. Ellen Hartley called to tell him and said nothing else about his career, which was her way of saying it was fine. The full recording went out the same week the finding did, and the street changed its mind in about a day and a half. The 22-second clip was still up somewhere and probably always would be, but it stopped being the only thing that existed. Frank Alvarado came over with a case of something and did not stay long. Nora Fielding apologized for a thing she had not done, which was standing there, and Malcolm told her she had said his name out loud when nobody else did, and that it had been the only decent sound in the yard. Ray Doyle did not apologize for anything. He came across the street, looked up at the doorbell above his own door, and said he was leaving the angle exactly where it was. That was the part that stayed with Malcolm afterwards, sitting in the back room with the window open. He had won the whole thing on the exact day he gave away every piece of power he had. If he had signed, he would have taken the contract from them and lost everything else. And Carl Rennick would have stayed a man who drove too fast on a wet ramp. Because he let go of it, 90 pages went into a federal record with a dead driver's name on the first one. He thought about Norfolk once in September and then put it down. That version of him had spent 6 months proving he had not started something. This time, 40 people and 2 cameras had proved it for him, and the difference was not luck. The difference was that he had spent 2 months building a record while a young man screamed at him in the street, and every boring, humiliating entry in that log had been worth exactly what it cost. The Beaumonts listed the house in September. Travis came down the street on a Thursday evening while Malcolm was coiling a hose in the side yard. He stopped at the edge of the driveway and stayed there farther back than he had ever stood before. "I'm supposed to say I'm sorry," he said, "so I'm saying it, but that's not why I came." Malcolm finished the coil, set it on the hook, and turned around. "You had me on the ground with your knee in the right place and 40 people filming." Travis's voice was flat, like he had practiced the sentence until it stopped costing him anything. "You could have ended my whole life right there, and everybody would have said I earned it. Why didn't you?" Malcolm looked at him a moment, at the jacket and the shoulders and the 21 years standing in his driveway, asking the only real question the kid had ever asked anybody. "Because I've never fought to prove I was stronger than somebody," he said. "I fight when there's no other way left to protect something that's true. That's it. That's the whole rule." He picked his work gloves off the porch rail and set them on the step. "And when it does come to that, the hard part isn't winning. Anybody can win. The hard part is knowing the exact second to stop and stopping there whether or not anyone's watching." He looked back at the young man. "You had 3 belts and nobody ever taught you that. It wasn't your fault. It is now." Travis stood with that for a while. Then he put his hand out and Malcolm shook it once. The young man walked back up Halden Court past the green where the tents had come down 6 weeks ago, and the grass had already grown back over the spot, and he did not turn around. The car was gone from the corner lot by the end of the month. The house sold in November to a couple who asked Nora Fielding whether the neighborhood was quiet, and she told them it was. Malcolm turned on the porch light that night out of habit and went to bed at the usual time. And in the morning, he ran his loop out past the mailboxes and down to where the street gives up and turns into pine trees. Graham Whitaker was on his porch with a cup of coffee in both hands. He nodded once. Malcolm nodded back and made the turn for home.